Thank you very much for being here for the final Your Historians talk of the spring 2026 season. I would like to particularly thank the Ames History Museum and Cassie Vance for hosting us for these last 2 years in these wonderful surroundings, in this marvelous building, in this terrific museum, which is something that Ames and Story County have every right to be proud of. If you're not a member, there are membership forms over here. You're welcome, Pam. And also there are cards about another lecture series. There are 2 lectures coming up in this series, one on April the 22nd about Henry Wallace, and then another one on May the 19th about Ames athletes who made it big. So there's this card. If you're interested in those, there are cards over there for you to take. I'm Simon Cordery, I'm chair of the history department, and usually for those of you who've been here before, I'm the one doing the introducing, so let me introduce myself. I'm Simon Cordery, I'm chair of the history department. Okay, I'm going to talk about railroads. I'm going to talk about the railroad industry. And you might think that I'm going to be talking about, well, large locomotives, or express trains, or maybe gorgeous terminus stations like Grand Central in New York. Perhaps those magnificent machines that roll through Ames on a regular basis. I might touch on some of those. I'm really going to talk about champagne, ice cream, champagne, porters, and clean linens and the importance thereof. I'm going to talk about how fire insurance was an important part of the American economy. And I'm going to talk about hansom cabs. But all of these fold into the subject of how a small railroad equipment manufacturer grew into an international brand. I'm going to talk about a man who did that, Albert Benton Pullman, who was central to the origins and the success of the Pullman Company. I'll talk about how and why we don't know very much about Albert Pullman. And I'll talk a little bit about how Albert Benton Pullman's life has allowed us to learn a bit more about the Gilded Age economy and how the Gilded Age economy developed. The Gilded Age from roughly 1877 to 1901, that era of incredible growth in virtually every area of American life. And about how Albert Pullman elevated Pullman into a household name, and about his disastrous investment career. And I'll start off by discussing his early years, his early life, and his family, and then him as a railroad pioneer, because he was in many ways a railroad pioneer. Also as an entrepreneur, not quite as successful as an entrepreneur as he was as a railroad pioneer. Then I'll talk about why and how he was erased, literally deleted from history, and then the importance of bringing him back into the story, and not just him, but what he represents in the American economy. So let me start off with Albert Benton Pullman's early years. He was born in October of 1828 in upstate New York. He was born into a family of, I suppose, call them lower middle class. They were carpenters and building movers. They were universalists in their religious faith. There were 8 surviving children. And if you look at this picture, you can see in the middle there, there's Louis and Emily, the parents. And then this is Albert. This is George Pullman. If you know anything about the railroad industry, it's George Pullman that you've probably heard about. It's his name that's attached to the Pullman cars that used to carry Americans all across the United States. And then his other siblings, Royal Henry, the eldest brother, I love that name, Royal. James is to Albert's right, and then in the middle, Charles, and then down at the bottom, there's young Frank, and then Emily and Helen, the 2 daughters. Father Louis was a carpenter and a building mover, and they were a family that you would say is devoutly American and devoutly upwardly mobile. And Albert represents that upward mobility to a very large extent. In 1848, he's the first one to leave this tight-knit group. When he moves to Grand Rapids, Michigan, Grand Rapids was the furniture capital of the United States of America. It was burgeoning industrially, and Albert himself was exceptionally good at woodwork. He was a craftsman. This is a table that is still in the collection of the Grand Rapids Public Museum today. There are other pieces that he put together that are still in the museum. Trust me, there's nothing by George in that museum. George was hopeless when it came to woodwork, and that's part of the key to this story. Albert was terrible with money. It just frittered through his hands. He loved to spend it. He was very gregarious. He loved to be always going out with his friends, and he loved nothing better than to have a good time with his pals. And when George came through in 1857, he found Albert and Emily living in virtual poverty. And he said to Albert, "Come with me to Chicago. In Chicago, there is a need for building lifters." The city of Chicago was at that very moment putting sewers in its streets. And what it was doing, because it was on a lake, what it was doing was essentially putting the sewers on the existing streets and then infilling above them. So one day you were sitting, eating breakfast, and the next day you've lost your view because your window has been covered by dirt. So in order to mitigate that problem, a series of buildings all across central Chicago were lifted, including in some cases whole blocks of buildings. And this is a famous example on Lake Street where Albert Pullman was part of the crew that helped to lift an entire block. They lifted it ultimately 6 feet up without closing the businesses and with no one really being aware of the movement underneath them. It was a very successful, but also very temporary occupation, because of course when the buildings have been lifted, there's no more building lifting to be done in Chicago. George recognized this. George is the entrepreneur of the family. He's the business brains of the family, and George knew that something else was vital for his financial security and his family's future. And it was George who decided what the family should do is create a company. Here you see it, Pullman's sleeping car line, the first iteration of what will become Pullman's Palace Car Company. Pullman's sleeping car line was George's idea because he realized that as the railroad network expanded, as the runs got longer and longer, and as more and more overnight travel took place, people wanted to travel in comfort. Before the Pullman cars, there were about 6 other sleeping car companies. So George recognized that he had to do something in order to separate his cars from the herd. And this is where his brother came in. Albert was responsible for 3 elements of the development of Pullman's Palace Car Company. It was Albert who was responsible for the elaborate Pullman designs. The interior of the cars in particular made Pullman stand out. He was also very good at marketing. He was a gregarious. He was someone who never met a stranger. He loved to talk. He knew how to get the news out, and he did so brilliantly. George also almost certainly hired the first black Pullman porters. So his work was fundamental to the success of Pullman's Palace Car Company. So let me explain each in turn the designs. The first Pullman Palace car rolled off onto the rails in Bloomington, Illinois in 1859. It was a car that had bench seats that converted into beds, and they also had pull-down bunks that allowed you to turn what was a simple sleeping arrangement into a relatively comfortable overnight arrangement with heavy curtains that you would pull around this particular sleeping berth for at least a modicum of privacy. The initial interiors were made of cherry wood. They were intricately carved, designed by Albert, but also very, very delicate, and they needed constant repairs. The cars also were sometimes equipped with organs for musical entertainment en route. And that's in part because Albert loved music. He was someone who enjoyed playing the organ. He enjoyed singing. Sometimes he and his daughter would go out on runs and they would entertain the passengers on some of those runs. George also loved people, and that was a key to his ability to market Pullman cars. George, did I say George? How many times have I said George? 4. Thank you for counting, Jeremy. I meant Albert. Albert loves people. Albert plays the organ. Albert's daughter goes out on the runs singing with him. Albert is very outgoing and gregarious, and he's someone who goes through the various newspaper offices in Chicago. He becomes friends with the journalists, he becomes friends with the editors. And this is a time when American newspapers primarily published stories from other American newspapers. They relied on each other for their material. And so Albert provided newspapers with material. He would, very cleverly write up this sort of, well, puff piece about Pullman cars, which the newspapers were grateful for. And they would print them and publish them and begin the process of allowing Pullman as a name, as a brand, and as something that was automatically equated with luxury into the minds of most Americans. These stories, as you can read them in the newspapers, follow a pretty similar pattern. There's a kind of a routine that you can see, but nonetheless, that repetition helps to bring home the idea that this is luxury. Pullman travel is luxury. Pullman travel also had to be sold. And one of the ways of selling Pullman travel was through excursions. Essentially, free trips for people who might be able to influence the public into purchasing Pullman cars or traveling on Pullman cars. And so these excursions were really advertising campaigns. And Albert was a master at organizing them. Starting in 1859, the first excursion went from downtown Chicago, the Van Buren Street station, down to Summit, Illinois, which is about 12 miles south of downtown. At the time, of course, it was in the middle of nowhere. Now it's basically right next to Midway Airport. So, but this was a way to show off these luxury cars to journalists, to editors, to politicians, to the agents, the ticket agents who would sell the cars, to anyone, railroad executives who might then go ahead and use Pullman and rent Pullman sleeping cars. In 1870, probably the most elaborate of the Pullman excursions that Albert engineered started when the Boston Board of Trade went to George Pullman. I do mean George this time. They went to George Pullman and they said to George Pullman, we would like to rent one of your cars and take a trip to San Francisco to meet up with our counterparts in California. Now that this is 1870, 1 year after the first transcontinental railroad, which ran from Council Bluffs, Iowa to Sacramento, and then obviously ultimately to San Francisco. We'd like to go from Boston to San Francisco. And George, sensing a brilliant promotional opportunity, said, great, I'll build you an entire train of cars. And for a mere $600 each, as many of your members and family members who want to go can go. Ultimately, 128 of the Boston Board of Trade members, friends, and families will go on this incredibly elaborate train known as the Pullman Hotel Express in 1870. Albert oversees the building of these cars. 6 of them are built in Aurora, Illinois, 2 more in Detroit. He accompanies the train out to Boston. They arrive in Boston on the 21st of May, 1870. The train is put on display for a day. This is a common Pullman practice. You open it to the public. Albert will claim that 50,000 people walk through it. It's probably a slight exaggeration, as promoters tend to do, but nonetheless, it's a great way to show off your wares. And so people did walk through the Pullman Hotel Express. A couple of days later, on the 23rd of May, the passengers and crew left Boston and they made their way west. The cars themselves included a barber, a fully stocked bar, a wine room, 2 hotel cars with kitchens and toilets, dining rooms and sleeping berths, along with an Associated Press telegraph, a printing press, and 10,000 envelopes in order to put into the mail the daily newsletter that was published on board the Pullman Hotel Express, the transcontinental. This was an incredible promotional tour de force. They reached San Francisco ultimately just 6 days later on May the 28th, 6 days after leaving Boston. That included an overnight in Chicago. Chicago then as now is a place where all the trains go and they all stop for a while because you can't go through Chicago easily. So the train went from Boston to Chicago. The passengers overnighted in Chicago, get on the train the next day after it's been cleaned and go off to San Francisco. In San Francisco, some of the excursionists went to Yosemite, they went to some of the original 49er mines, but much of the business was business. And so the members of the Boston Board of Trade chatted with California business people, bankers and manufacturers and other commercial leaders in order to begin the process of trading between California and Boston. After they returned to Boston on June the 23rd, the excursionists thanked Albert in what would become quite a routine kind of rhetoric of gratitude, the idea that he had prepared so beautiful and commodious a train of cars and making such arrangements as to secure the convenience and comfort of all passengers during the entire trip. Albert loved that sort of encomium and made sure that it was always printed in the news reports of the excursions that he led. Let me talk about the Pullman porters. Pullman porters, probably the most famous element of Pullman travel, probably the piece of the pie that's most commonly associated with Pullman cars, because the porters symbolized Pullman luxury. A porter helped passengers find their berths, made sure they got off at their appointed stops, made sure they were comfortable, brought them pillows and cushions, opened windows, closed windows, whatever the passengers need. These discreet, respectful, and trustworthy porters made sure that the passage of Pullman passengers was comfortable. Towards the end of the 19th century, people began to call the porters George, after George Pullman. And that seems to be the origin of the idea that George Pullman hired the first Pullman porters. Historians acknowledge that there's no documentary evidence to support this, none at all. And in fact, I would argue that there is plenty of circumstantial evidence to suggest that it was Albert who hired the first Pullman porters. When Albert first bought a house in Chicago, when he first moved to Chicago full-time in 1861, he hired a black carriage. He hired a black coachman. He hired someone to take care of and drive his coach and horses. Albert was in charge of the Pullman office. He hired all the early employees, while George, from 1860 to 1863, was off in Colorado raising capital for the Pullman company. It was Albert who was in charge of the day-to-day running of the Pullman company, and it's almost certainly Albert who hired the first black Pullman porters. How about Albert's career as an entrepreneur? He wasn't just a railroad pioneer, he's also an entrepreneur. Albert understood that George was becoming wealthy not just because of his ownership of Pullman shares, but also because he invested outside of Pullman, insurance companies, banks, lots of different types of economic activity, and Albert wanted to follow suit. If you're a porter, your job never ends. When the run comes to a close in Chicago and the passengers detrain and make their way home or to business or to holiday, the porters are charged with cleaning the car, taking all of the linen, thousands, literally thousands of pieces of linen, to the laundry. All right, so I said that Albert is the general superintendent of Pullman's Palace Car Company, and it's Albert who decides the laundry with which the Pullman company is going to sign a contract to clean all of those linens. And so he invests in Jennings Laundry and becomes a director of Jennings Laundry with Ebenezer Jennings, the owner of the Jennings Laundry, who will become one of Albert's best friends, one of his lasting business acquaintances, and the Jennings Laundry will be one of the few perpetually profitable investments that Albert has made. So close are Jennings and Albert that when Albert dies, Ebenezer Jennings is one of the pallbearers at his funeral. The Jennings Laundry and Albert were synonymous in the public mind. This is one of the ways that Albert becomes well known. Albert was lucky, very lucky, to have been able to invest in the Jennings Laundry. Not quite so fortunate was his investment in a fire insurance company called the Great Western Insurance Company based in Chicago. He got brought into the great Western Insurance Company by George Albert's father-in-law. Hartel Stewart brought Albert in as a director of the Great Western Insurance Company. Albert owned ultimately $10,000 worth of shares. That's about $450,000 in money today. In the 19th century, when you became a shareholder, you subscribed to buy shares. You said, okay, here's $2,000 towards my $10,000 worth of shares. The other $8,000 I'll pay off over time. Quite often the idea was that you would pay it off with profits from the company, so you never actually have to pay anything, and you become ultimately the owner of $10,000 worth of shares. Albert doubled his investment from $5,000 to $10,000 on the 6th of October, 1871. On the 6th of October, 1871, Albert decided to loan some money to a friend, and as the as the security on this loan, he got shares in return. So, of course, only $1,000 of that $5,000 has been paid up. If something goes wrong, Albert's on the hook for $4,000 there and $4,000 of his own shares. And boy, did something go wrong. 2 days later, on the 8th of October, 1871, the city of Chicago basically burned down. The Great Chicago Fire, as it quickly became known, lasted for about 3 days. Luckily, only about 300 people out of the 300,000 or so who lived there were killed, but buildings weren't quite as mobile as people. About 18,000 buildings across 3,000 acres were destroyed. When all was said and done, the 129 fire insurance companies that did business in Chicago were bankrupt, and that included 14 local insurance companies, including, of course, the Great Western Insurance Company. Now, the Great Western Insurance Company kept pushing out news releases to say, we're fine, we have enough money to cover all of the policies that we have put out. It's almost certain that the man with the connections to the press to put out those news releases was Albert Pullman. These releases were published as far north as Milwaukee and as far south as St. Louis. Well, this was a totally expected disaster. The fire insurance companies had not been practicing particularly strong financial or any kind of insurance practices at all. There were regulations, but there was no enforcement of the regulations. 2 Daily Tribune journalists wrote that Chicago was reaping in the bankruptcy of her local companies the fruits of the ruinous policy adopted of taking risks at any rate and for any amount on any description of property. When the Great Western finally declared bankruptcy on February the 6th, 1872, Albert owed $8,000. He tried to evade responsibility for that $8,000. Slowly but surely, the receiver reconstructed the records of the company, and Albert's name, along with the other directors, came to the public consciousness. 1878, in an attempt to force a way to avoid meeting his obligation, a case called Pullman versus Upton made its way to the Supreme Court of the United States, where Albert Pullman, who was at the time being defended by a Pullman company lawyer by the name of H.S. Monroe. H.S. Monroe argued that Albert Pullman should not be held responsible for this repayment of all of this money because, well, the company didn't exist. So how could the documents proving that he owed this money be valid? Well, the court booted that one out, of course, without even really thinking about it. The second line of defense was slightly more sophisticated. The doctrine of non-assumpsit, which means basically you deny having made a promise to do something. And Albert denied that he had promised to be responsible for paying the $8,000 towards the total cost of the Great Western Insurance Company loans. Supreme Court Justice Strong dismissed this line of reasoning. Writing for the majority, he said that Albert had assumed responsibility for the outstanding balance as soon as he had registered the shares in his name. So Albert is not going to be able to evade responsibility for this debt. Ultimately, he has to repay the $8,000. Ultimately, it's pretty clear that George helped him out. And so Albert sort of laid low for a while and decided that maybe this entrepreneurial game wasn't the best way to, oh, wait a minute. Nope, he loved investing. Pretty quickly, he decided he's going to try and recoup his losses, repay his brother, and serve the people of Chicago by offering them hansom cabs. In 1884, the Chicago Hansom Cab Company was created in order to bring hansom cabs to Chicago. Now, Albert had spent some time in London helping to bring the Pullman Company cars to the railroads of England, and he knew how very, very rapid and how very, very efficient hansom cabs could be, especially on crowded streets. And so he thought this would be a great idea. Albert sets himself up as the president of this company. He does so in part because he loves horses. One of Albert's great loves, in addition to music, is horses. He was one of the founding members of the Washington Park racetrack. There was in Chicago in the 1880s and 1890s an annual derby, which included a procession through the streets of downtown and a race out at the Washington Park track. And he loved all of this. He thought it was brilliant. And so naturally attaching horses to carts was something that he could get behind quite easily. This hansom cab company promised to put 50 cabs patterned closely after those in London onto the streets of Chicago. Their business model was rather like the Pullman Company. The Pullman Company rented its cars to railroad corporations. The cars came with porters who were company employees, porters and conductors who were company employees. The hansom cab company also rented the cabs to drivers. Now, the problem here was that they didn't have a particularly firm hold on the training and the conduct of the drivers. The hansom cab company quickly got a bad reputation about the drivers were charging whatever they wanted, they couldn't be relied on, they drove the horses to the point of death, and the company faced a series of lawsuits from knocking over pedestrians and from passengers who felt that they had been subject to theft. So they looked for some investment capital. And this investment capital comes from a man by the name of Charles Yerkes. Charles Yerkes arrived in Chicago in 1884, having just been released from prison in Philadelphia for embezzlement. He is a financier who knows how to make and use money. And he realizes, Charles Yerkes realizes, that what Chicago needed was a unified mass transit system. And so he recognizes that the hansom cab company has two things that he wants. It has a license to operate on the streets of Chicago, and it has some barns, as they call the sheds, where they kept their horses and the equipment. It has some barns that he can use for his traction engines. And so he decides that he is going to invest in this company, and he is pretty clear that what he wants to do is close it down. And he tells the other directors that. And the other directors, including Albert, say, no way, we're not going to close down. So they perform what in American footballing terms is known as an end around. They decide that they are going to simply ignore Charles Yerkes. They take all of the shares except for Yerkes' small holdings, and they sell them at a discount to one of the nieces of one of the directors, who then sells the shares back to the company at a discount, and they think that they have managed to outsmart Charles Yerkes. There's no outsmarting Charles Yerkes. He takes them to court. The court, of course, naturally decides in favor of Charles Yerkes. The fraudulent transaction was not going to stand in a court of law. So poor old Albert has lost his hansom cab company. His blown investment, to be fair, is just one of 50 companies that Charles Yerkes will forcibly take over on his way to creating a transit empire in Chicagoland and to give Charles Yerkes his due. It worked very, very well. And then he went to London and did the same thing with the underground in London. So he clearly knew what he was doing. Also, he died of a heart attack on an underground station in London. What a way to go. So Charles Yerkes, a robber baron, but also interesting traction figure. But for Albert, a very real problem because it's yet another loss. And there are other investments I haven't talked about, investments in land, investments in silver mines, investment in banks that Albert also lost money on. So why has Albert been erased from history? Why don't you know about Albert? Why don't we have Albert in history books? I mean, to be fair, he designed the early cars, he helped to market them, he probably hired the first Pullman porters. Why is he unknown? Part of the answer is Albert himself. Albert himself was very, 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 very close to his wife and his children, but very, 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 very distant from the rest of the Pullman wider family. The Pullmans were great letter writers, and the 7 siblings would have these circular letters where Royal Albert would start it off. He would send it to James. James would add his bit at the bottom and send it on, and ultimately it would make its way to their mother, the matriarch. And Albert just didn't take part. He wasn't interested in playing. So we have all these lovely letters in the Chicago History Museum Research Center, which occasionally say things about Albert, but don't actually have Albert's words in them. So he sort of cut himself out of the family to the extent that when their mother dies, he doesn't attend the funeral. And in her obituaries, the obituaries talk about her 7 children. So Albert's not at the funeral, and he's not even in his mother's obituary. He's kind of pushed himself away from the immediate family to that extent. And it's, to be fair, he didn't probably enjoy playing second fiddle to his younger brother, George. The eldest brother had gone into the ministry, another brother had gone into the ministry, no competition there. But George was really the competition. George was president of Pullman's Palace Car Company, and the possessive is George. It's George Pullman's Palace Car Company. Albert's investment career seems to have been an attempt to one-up George. He's trying to show the family that he is at least as successful as his younger brother. But he keeps making mistakes. In 1883, he sold off some Pullman shares that created a run on the Pullman company. This had a disastrous effect on his relationship with George, as you might imagine, especially because George was forced to buy up the shares as soon as they came onto the market in order to avoid them losing value and the company losing its value. This was a time when the railroad industry was overexpanded. It was a bad time to sell shares if what you're trying to do is to protect their value. Albert then, in 1886, with a syndicate of investors, tried to corner the wheat market on the Chicago Exchange. Yeah, this was another bad move, another one in which he lost a lot of money, another one in which his brother had to bail him out. But it's also telling how the Pullman Company dealt with Albert. A company vice president by the name of Horace Porter, General Horace Porter, who had been Ulysses S. Grant's adjutant during the Civil War and served in the Grant administration until becoming a vice president of the Pullman Company, and it's basically the head of its New York office. Horace Grant contributed a chapter to this book on the early history of American railways, a chapter about passenger travel in which he wrote extensively and exclusively about Pullman cars, gave George full credit for inventing the Pullman car, wrote about the early years, said nothing about Albert. In 1917, the Pullman Company hired a Chicago advertising executive and novelist by the name of Joseph Husband to write its official history. Husband gives Albert 1 mention. This is the only substantive mention of Albert Pullman in the official history of Pullman's Palace Car Company. There's also a list of people who traveled on an excursion run in 1887 that lists Albert, but this is it. So there are multiple other examples of how the Pullman Company excised Albert from their history. Every time George gave an interview to the newspapers, he would, of course, bloat himself and say nothing about poor old Albert. So ultimately, who cares? So what? So what if we don't know about Albert Benton Pullman? Why should we care? One reason is he was very well known in his own time. When he died in 1893, the obituaries were all across the United States of America. Just about every newspaper in the country carried an obituary. And there are various types of obituaries. Some of them talked about him as the head of manufacturing for the Pullman Company. Some of them mentioned his investment career. Some of them even talked about the fact that he was stupid enough to try and make a run on the grain market. But everywhere you get the sense that that Albert Pullman's name was recognized, that Albert Pullman was someone people knew. It is certainly true that his interior designs helped to stamp Pullman cars as distinctive. They helped to give the Pullman brand its cachet. His marketing cemented it. His hiring the porters gave another edge over competitors. So there's that, his contributions to the Pullman Company. But I would argue there's a wider significance as well to the career and life of Albert Benton Pullman. First of all, he was what we might call an everyday entrepreneur. He's one of those many, and they are legion, investors who tried everything in order to emulate the people we know, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Pullmans, people who have streets named after them in towns like Ames, Iowa. Those are the names that we remember. Those are the names they're trying to emulate. But in doing that, they're keeping capital circulating. And capitalism exists in large measure because the money keeps pumping through the system. And the more the money pumps, the larger the system gets. And that's what these entrepreneurs, these everyday entrepreneurs, did. Their lives were perilous and unpredictable. Success was often the result of sheer good fortune, and their failure the consequence of misfortune, such as investing in a fire insurance company 2 days before an enormous fire destroyed the city of Chicago. That's just bad timing. That's bad luck. You can't legislate against that. But it will, unfortunately, create problems for you financially. Albert Pullman was like the thousands of small investors. Albert Pullman was one of those investors who quite simply kept on trying, despite the chaos, the utter chaos of Gilded Age economic activity. Their lives remind us of the diversity of business practices, of the risks, the real risks of entering the sea of business. And to understand that development, to understand the way capitalism emerged, and especially in the Gilded Age grew, I would argue that we need to remember people like Albert Benton Pullman. Thanks very much. All right, now the good bit, questions.
How did you get on to?
Okay, how did I find Albert Pullman? So Albert Pullman as a topic of study emerged out of research I was doing for a history of Illinois railroads. I was working in the Pullman archives in Chicago, and this name kept appearing. Always somehow involved, never peripheral until the 1880s, but also mentioned in the biography of George Pullman, mentioned in histories of Pullman, Illinois, the company town. But he was always, but who is Albert Pullman? So I kept on pushing. I went to, and so this is where digital newspapers are so valuable, because you can search digital newspapers. And so I started to search for Albert Pullman and discovered all this amazing stuff about him, his investment in the Great Western Insurance Company, his investment in the National Bank of Chicago, which was a complete and utter disaster, his investment in silver mines, his fraudulent land investment, and he just kept appearing. So what's fascinating to me is there's all this material about Albert Pullman, and also loads of other people we may or may not have heard of. John Drake, also the Drake Hotel in Chicago in the 19th century, and the Drake feasts were famous. John Drake was one member of multiple networks that Albert Pullman was part of. And so I kept bringing him into all of these connections, including, well, one of the founders of Western Electric, one of the founders of the telegraph system of the United States, Anson Stager. He was also involved in the early development of telephone. He was also very interested in electricity. But it's just, to me, it became both a way to understand the Pullman Company, which I thought I was doing. I thought I was writing a history of the Pullman Company. Maybe through the lens of Albert, maybe not. What I really wanted to do, I thought I was going to do, was to write a history of the town of Pullman before the strike, looking at, in particular, the actual manufacturing. There's an excellent book about the town of Pullman, but it doesn't really go into the manufacturing side of things. So I wanted to kind of do, there's a wonderful kind of anthropological history of industry of one particular factory called Rockdale. I was going to do something like that, Anthony Wallace's Rockdale, where we a deep dive into Pullman manufacturing. Turns out those records hadn't been organized yet. They were in the Newberry Library in Chicago. They hadn't been cataloged. I couldn't get to them. But Albert kept popping up. So I pursued Albert, and that's where I ended up.
Which leads to another question. So if you have access to the archival material of a company, where did his name pop up? Was it in meeting minutes or invoices or business memos?
So it was primarily in directors' reports, and it was also in the manufacturing reports. So there was some material that I was able to look at from the early years of the manufacturing that had Albert's name in them, and then correspondence, company correspondence, especially between George and Albert in the early years. There's a fair amount of back and forth when George is in Colorado, talking about how, so George relied on Albert for financial reports, and George relied on Albert to essentially make sure the cars were running properly and to make sure that they had enough passengers. So, and to run the office in Chicago.
So I'm assuming you read the book on the railroad history.
Yes,
the chapter. After going through the archival material and reading what was in the book, did you see a major disconnect in what was portrayed in the history book? The official Pullman
Sure.
history?
Oh, the Joseph Husband. Yeah, absolutely. Completely. Yes. I mean, that it was Husband's book that made me begin to believe that Albert had been deliberately written out. And so the question becomes why? And I think part of it is George's ego. George could never admit that anyone else could possibly have had anything to do with the invention of the sleeping car other than himself. But also I think it's because Albert, towards the end of his investment career, had damaged the Pullman name. Right? Albert became known in the public mind, for people who read the newspaper, as not a particularly good investor. Yeah, he kept making mistakes.
Yeah.
And that's not so good for the brand.
Thank you for that, Simon. It was really great, really enjoyable. So I'll give maybe two questions. The first is somewhat observational and speculative, and that is in you showing all the pictures of the cars, I couldn't help but make a connection with like naval or nautical construction. And I'm wondering if Albert had any sort of connection to anything like naval that inspired his design.
That's no, interesting question, Brian, because his brother Charlie rejoins the Pullman Company later on and starts to design streetcars that look like boats. Albert had the only connection Albert had to any kind of maritime activity was through the Erie Canal. He grew up, the buildings that the family moved were buildings that were being pushed back from the Erie Canal. When the canal was being expanded, it was being widened. So that would have been his only experience with direct experience with anything maritime before he got on the ship and went to England, but that was later on.
The other question was in regards to the Pullman porters. Do you have a sense of his views on race at the time, and like why, like did he think differently perhaps than other people? Like why black men for those jobs?
Yeah, I mean the kind of the orthodox story is that racist George Pullman hired black men who were freed slaves because he knew they could be easily controlled. That's the kind of the mainstream story. That's a difficult one to sustain with Albert, in part because of the universalist faith that tried to teach that everyone was equal, right? So universalists, well, they were very active in abolitionism for one thing. Albert seemed to have been maybe less racist than others of his ilk. I mean, obviously, in the 19th century, it would have been virtually impossible not to have been racist, since that's part of the culture, since that's what you grow up with, right? This great racial divide. But he appears to have at least understood that when Jesus said we all have a soul and we're all equal in that sort of fundamental way, that possibly Albert Pullman believed that, right? I mean, ultimately, it's an unanswerable question. Sadly, because he didn't write enough himself about anything to do with that. And I've read much of the family correspondence, and they don't seem to talk about it either. So I don't really know, ultimately, right? This is all speculation, admittedly based on some I think pretty compelling circumstantial evidence.
Thanks.
Jeremy?
Simon, thank you as well. Two questions as well. One's a factual one and one's more interpretive. What level of luxury are we talking about to ride a Pullman car, right? Is this sort of like accessible luxury for a certain subset, or is it how much did it cost at a certain point to ride?
Yeah.
You answered Brian's question for
Sure. So the sleeping cars were primarily for wealthy Americans. Now, you use the word aspirational, and it's also in the sense that railroad companies recognized, because they heard it from their passengers, that passengers like to be sort of associated with Pullman luxury. So even if you can't ride in a Pullman car, there were passengers who chose one railroad over another because its trains ran Pullman cars. And so they're in a train where there's a Pullman car, right? But Pullman itself produces a range of cars. So there's the luxurious sleeping cars, there's the dining cars, but there are also day cars, which are slightly more comfortable than the regular cars. They also build suburban cars that are slightly more comfortable than suburban cars. They build the first set of transit cars for the elevated railroads in New York City, which are also, themselves very luxurious compared to transit cars everywhere else in the world. So the Pullman brand had a vested interest in making sure that anything that had that name on it had at least a tincture of luxury. And so even the emigrant cars, as they were called, the day cars, were recognized as being, in part because of the springs that they used for the trucks, they used what were called paper wheels for a soft ride. Paper wheels were compressed paper, believe it or not, on the inside of a metal band, and then with obviously iron holding it all together for a comfortable ride.
So it's a luxury brand.
Yes.
But the second question is, I think I've learned something about the 19th century. And you talk about capitalism, about how these everyday entrepreneurs are about keeping the money flowing.
Yes.
Is there another thing you can tell me about capitalism in the late 19th century United States, in the sense of like, is it a incredibly sort of chaotic, and is failure far more common than success? Is this a consequence of both emerging capitalism, or is it a consequence of unregulated? I mean, maybe these are the answers, but I wonder if you could elaborate.
It's unregulated. It's also extraordinarily litigious. Virtually everyone who invested in anything at one point or another is going to be sued. You're going to find yourself in a court of law. It's also something that just about any middle-class American and many working Americans believed they could get involved in somehow. One of the ways in was through patenting. One of the great American pastimes was patenting something, right? There are thousands and thousands of patents. Albert himself had like 15 patents, and almost every American family of any worth knew or had someone who had a patent. So that's another way in, is by being an inventor who strikes it rich through someone monetizing your patent. It's chaotic in the sense that it is unregulated. Perhaps the biggest regulator of American capitalism was J.P. Morgan, who had a capacity for stepping in and trying to save the system when it looked like it might collapse. The government did not, in the Gilded Age, have an appetite for regulation beyond the tariff. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but it's a system that wouldn't have existed without these small investors making their contributions, and also kind of takes the focus away from the large corporation, which we tend to see as the symbol of the Gilded Age. But people like Albert were able to, extract contracts from those large corporations and become wealthy through a laundry, for example.
Do the failures put money back in? I mean, is that what happens? Is that better than a successful company in some way for the system?
For the system?
Yeah.
I think it's all part of the same ecosystem. Yeah. David?
How many of Albert's cars survived?
None.
None at all?
None.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. The oldest still running Pullman car is from the 1920s. There are no operational Pullman cars from the 19th century.
Well, not even operational, are there some?
Nope.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, sadly. Yeah. The very first well-known Pullman car, the Pioneer, was very quickly turned into a maintenance of way car for workers to sleep in, and then it burnt down. I mean, they were obsolete almost as soon as they left the shops. And also very fragile, needed constant maintenance, constant repairs.